All right, so we're back, and today we're going to be looking at something kind of different.
Oh,
Yeah, we're going deep on learning English as a second language,
okay.
but we're also going to be talking about the American housing market.
Interesting combination.
Yeah, and all of this is coming from a YouTube podcast, and it's transcript which follows a host's journey through both of these things.
So, like two sides of the same coin.
Yeah, exactly. It's really fascinating.
I'm intrigued.
So to kick things off, the podcast really focuses on the benefits of learning English.
Sure, like opening up global opportunities.
Exactly. And, boosting career prospects.
Right, and connecting with more people from diverse backgrounds.
All that good stuff.
For sure.
But then it takes an interesting turn.
How so?
Well, the podcast hosts get really honest about their experiences with traditional English education.
Ah, I see.
They talk about how they learned all the grammar rules and could write well enough,
Yeah.
but they still felt like they couldn't really speak the language.
Oh, yeah, I've heard that from a lot of learners.
It's a common issue, that disconnect between textbook English and actual conversation.
Yeah, like knowing the rules, but not being able to apply them in real time.
Exactly. And so to bridge that gap, they talk about this technique called shadowing.
Shadowing.
Yeah, it's where you basically mimic native speakers to get the pronunciation and flow down.
Oh, interesting. Like you're following in their shadow, trying to sound just like them.
Exactly. And along with that, they also emphasize immersing yourself in English media.
Things like news, podcasts, movies, music.
Yeah, all of that. The idea is to surround yourself with the language as much as possible.
So it's not just about studying, it's about absorbing the language organically.
Exactly. It makes you realize that learning a language is more than just memorizing vocabulary.
Right. It's about understanding the nuances, the rhythm, the natural way it's spoken.
Totally. And this podcast suggests that a lot of traditional teaching methods miss that.
I see. They focus on the structure, but not necessarily the soul of the language.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
So we've talked about English learning. Now, how does the housing market tie into all of this?
Well, the podcast host shares their experience of buying their first home in the U.S.
Ah, the American dream in action.
Right. And they talk about the excitement and the sense of accomplishment.
Sure, achieving that milestone of homeownership.
Yeah. But they also don't shy away from the financial realities.
Like what?
Well, for starters, they talk about the down payment, that big chunk of money you need up front.
Yeah, that can be a major hurdle for a lot of people, especially first-time buyers.
Absolutely, especially with rising house prices.
It's a different world than it used to be.
For sure. And the podcast host even mentions how their parents seem to buy homes much earlier in life.
Makes you wonder if the dream of home ownership is changing for younger generations.
Right. Like, is it becoming less attainable?
It was a valid question.
And speaking of navigating a tricky landscape, the podcast host also talks about their initial hesitation to work with a realtor.
Oh, they thought they could go it alone.
Yeah, they figured they could handle everything themselves.
That's a common thought, especially for first-time buyers.
Right. But they quickly realized that the U.S. housing market is way more complicated than it seems.
It's a lot more than just finding a house you like.
Exactly. There are so many legalities, negotiations, inspections. It's a whole process.
It's a whole world that most people don't have experience in.
And that's where a realtor comes in.
To guide you through that maze.
Yeah, they act as your advocate, your advisor. They handle all those behind-the-scenes details. And in the podcast, the host talks about how their realtor was constantly in communication with them.
Wow, so like daily calls, coordinating meetings, making sure everything was on track.
Exactly. They were super involved throughout the entire process.
That's interesting.
And one detail that stood out to me was that the seller actually ended up covering the realtor's commission.
Oh, that's something a lot of first-time buyers might not realize.
Yeah, it's not always the buyer who pays for that service.
Right, and it can make a big difference in the overall cost.
For sure. So we've got English learning goals leading to homeownership ambitions.
Good.
And now the podcast shifts gears to talk about the actual move, starting with the most basic step, getting boxes.
Ah, yes, the universal symbol of moving.
Right. And the host talks about how they gradually started packing up all the non-essential items.
Makes sense, starting with the things you won't need right away.
Exactly, trying to ease into the whole process.
I can relate to that.
But when it came to the big stuff, like furniture, they made a decision that a lot of us probably would have made.
Let me guess. They hired movers.
You got it. It's that classic dilemma, cost versus convenience.
Yeah, moving is tough, especially when you have a lot of stuff.
And while professional movers do cost money, sometimes it's worth it to avoid the stress.
Absolutely. Sometimes you just got to outsource the heavy lifting.
And as we'll see, Even with movers, things don't always go smoothly.
Oh, I have a feeling this is where things get interesting.
You have no idea.
So this is where the story takes like a hilarious turn.
Oh,
Yeah, you've got the movers,
okay.
a big moving truck,
Uh-huh.
and a downtown area with very limited parking.
Sounds like a recipe for disaster.
Well, it kind of was.
What happened?
So they ended up having to park blocks away from the apartment
Oh, no.
and then carry all the furniture, like an absurd distance.
Oh, wow.
It's almost like a sitcom, you know?
Yeah, I can picture it.
But it also highlights something important,
What's that?
the logistical challenges of moving that we often overlook.
Right. We think about packing and unpacking,
Yeah.
but we forget about the actual physical act of moving heavy stuff.
Especially in a busy city.
Totally.
It's a whole other level of difficulty.
And it sounds like in this case, it was especially chaotic.
Yeah, it was.
You know, it's interesting.
Mm.
The podcast host was initially resistant to hiring movers,
Right. They wanted to do it all themselves.
but then they ended up being so grateful for the help.
It's like sometimes asking for help isn't admitting defeat.
Yeah.
It's a smart move.
I agree.
It's about recognizing your limits, especially during stressful times.
And speaking of stressful times,
Oh.
the podcast host mentions that they were actually pregnant during this whole move.
Oh, wow. Talk about adding another layer of complexity.
Right. Like that definitely makes the decision to hire movers seem even more sensible.
Absolutely. It just highlights the human element of these big life events.
Yeah, there's a lot going on behind the scenes.
Exactly. Like we talk about the housing market in this abstract way,
Yeah,
but behind the statistics are real people dealing with real challenges.
for sure.
And sometimes those challenges involve a huge truck and nowhere to park.
It's a good reminder that things don't always go as planned.
Right. But there's also often humor to be found in those moments.
Totally. What stood out to you about the host's experience?
You know, I think the theme of resilience really resonated with me.
Okay.
Like, both learning a new language and navigating the U.S. housing market can be daunting.
Uh-huh.
There are setbacks, there are surprises, there's a lot to learn.
Mm.
But this podcast host really embraced the challenges.
He did.
They adapted to the unexpected and ultimately achieved their goals.
It's inspiring, right?
It is. It really is.
And it's not just about the end goal. It's
Right.
about how we grow throughout the process.
It's the journey, not just the destination.
I like that.
And, you know, it brings us back to something the host mentioned about the American dream.
Okay.
They talked about how their parents seemed to enter the housing market much earlier in life.
Yeah, like it was just a given.
Do you think that dream is changing for younger generations?
It's a tough question.
It is.
Like, on the one hand, homeownership is still seen as this huge symbol of success in the U.S.,
Definitely.
but the economic realities are shifting.
Right.
Wages haven't kept pace with rising housing costs.
Yeah.
Student debt is a burden for so many people.
All of that impacts affordability.
It does, and it makes me wonder if the traditional timeline of the American dream needs to evolve.
A valid point.
Like maybe renting is becoming a more viable long-term option for some people.
Maybe so.
And how do we ensure that younger generations aren't completely locked out of the market?
These are all questions that we need to be talking about.
Definitely. And, you know, this podcast gives us such a unique perspective.
How so?
Well, it starts with this personal story about learning English,
Uh-huh.
but it leads to these bigger discussions about the housing market, cultural values, even the logistics of moving.
It highlights how interconnected everything really is.
Yeah, like you never know where a learning journey might take you.
That's the beauty of it, right?
It is. And I think this deep dive really emphasizes that sometimes the most surprising connections can be the most illuminating.
I agree.
Yeah, it really makes you think about all the ripple effects of just learning a new language.
It's true.
It's not just about communicating, it's about opening these doors to
Yeah.
new experiences, new communities, even, like you said, new dreams like home ownership.
Absolutely. And it reminds us that personal growth is often tied to these bigger societal structures.
That's a good point.
And learning a language can give you the tools to navigate those structures.
For sure.
Whether it's the housing market, the education system, really any aspect of life in a new country,
It's empowering.
it is.
So for everyone listening, we'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah.
What connections have you made between learning English and other parts of your life?
Have you hit any unexpected roadblocks?
Or maybe found some surprising benefits? Share your experiences. We'd love to hear them.
We often get caught up in the practicalities of learning a language.
The grammar rules, the vocabulary lists.
Right. But it's also a journey of self-discovery.
That's so true.
It pushes you to step outside your comfort zone,
Yeah.
to adapt to new ways of thinking, and ultimately broaden your perspective.
It's about so much more than just the language itself.
Exactly.
It's about expanding your understanding of yourself and the world.
And sometimes those aha moments
Mhm.
come from the most unexpected places.
Like a chaotic moving day?
Right. Or a conversation about down payments.
This deep dive has definitely shown us that.
It has.
So as we wrap up today, we want to leave you with this thought. Keep exploring, keep learning,
And keep making those connections.
because you never know where your journey might lead or what fascinating insights you'll find along the way.
Each challenge, each unexpected turn is a chance to grow.
And a chance to write your own unique story.
Beautifully said.
Until next time, happy learning, everyone.